In this video, let's talk about the domain and range. So these two things are often asked from us when we make a sketch by hand. So what is the domain and what is the range? The domain is simply all the x values. So all the possible x values that we can use without getting into trouble. So that we can use. Now, why without getting into trouble? Some operations are not possible, such as dividing by 0. So if we have a function that is 1 divided by x, we know that x should not be 0. X is not 0. If we have square roots, for example, we know that x should be positive because square root of a negative number is imaginary. So some operations are just not possible. And we have to list all the possible x values as a domain where our graph starts and where our graph ends on the x-axis. So if we look at our picture for the that we are sketching, we're looking at the x-axis and we're asking where does the graph start and where does the graph end. For the range is all the y values that we get from using all possible x values. So the range is asking us, looking now just at the y, tell me where the picture starts and tell me where the picture ends. And that also is written in interval notation. So start to where does the picture end. So let's look at a couple examples and see what the domain and range might be. So let's begin with this example, which is a hyperbola. So here is a picture. Let's say y is 1 divided by x. So the diagram will look something like 1. The graph is everywhere except when we get to 0, it breaks because it's impossible to divide by 0. So that's what the picture of a hyperbola looks like. Domain is asking us, looking just at the x, where does the graph start and then where does the graph end, skipping all the parts that are impossible. So the graph begins as far back to the left as we can look. There will always be a graph because this arm will keep stretching that far. So the domain will begin at negative infinity. And then there will always be a graph until we get to this point, which is 0. But we can't use 0. And then again, we pick up right after 0, there is a graph once again. As soon as we move past the 0, all the way to plus infinity, there will always be a graph. So that's a domain. Now the range is looking just at the y's. Where does the picture begin? Well, here is the y-axis. Where does the graph start? As far back down as we look, there will always be this end of the picture will always stretch that far. So the domain also begins at negative infinity. But as we come up to the 0, the picture breaks. This picture here breaks as y hits 0. So at 0, we skip. And then again, we pick up at 0 and go all the way to plus infinity. So that's a domain and range for the hyperbola. Now let's look at a different example. Here is a graph of a parabola. So the parabola is just a regular U-shape, kind of looks like this. Where does the graph begin on the x-axis? Well, no matter how far to the left we look, this arm will be stretching that far. So the domain will begin at negative infinity. And then as we move from the left side to the right side, there is no gaps. The graph will just continue to forever. And no matter how far we go to the right, there will always be this graph. So all the way to plus infinity. Now, what is the range? So here's the same picture again. What is the range? It's supposed to go through the 0. So the range is the y-axis. Looking, where does the picture begin on the y-axis? Well, if we look at the negative side, there is no graph. So the graph doesn't even begin until we hit y equals 0. So the range starts at 0, and it can be 0 because 0 squared is possible. And then all the points after that, as far up as we go, there will always be a graph. So all the way to plus infinity, there will be a graph. So that's the domain and range for the parabola. Now, let's look at the square root function. So here is a square root of x, and it sort of looks like a square root. Let's redo the picture a little bit. So here is what the square root looks like. It sort of looks like a square root, like this, like one side of a parabola. And so where does the picture begin on the x-axis? On the left side, square roots of negative are imaginary, so there is nothing. The picture only starts with a 0 because square root of 0 is 0. So the domain is from 0 with a bracket, including 0, all the way to plus infinity. What's the range? Well, the range also, where does the picture start on the y? Well, there is nothing here. The picture only begins when we hit y equals 0. Then it goes up and up and up forever. So also from 0 including, and then all the way to infinity. And infinity always is in parentheses because it's not included. And just one last example. Let's suppose we have an ellipse, and the ellipse is going to be from negative 8 to 8 and from negative 5 to 5. What is the domain and what is the range? The domain is on the x. So if we were looking at it as if it was a face, we would be asking ourselves, here's the face, we're asking ourselves, the domain is how wide is the face? Where does it start? Where does it end on the x-axis? So it starts with negative 8, there's a bracket, negative 8, sorry, not infinity, negative 8, and then it ends with a bracket with a positive 8. Now the range is, if we're looking at the face, the range is how tall the face is. Where does the face begin, where the chin is, and where the top of the head is. So all of that space is the range. And for us, we start at negative 5 and we go to plus 5. So the range is from minus 5 to 5. And that's it for this example. And that's basically what domain and range is. So the domain is all the possible x values, and the range is all the y values that come from these possible x-axes. Thanks a lot for your time. Take care.